In this post, let's discuss positional space or three-dimensional space and how it relates to where your user is in the application. And it's really important that a user can very quickly draw your application's major spaces from memory after having used it only a few times the application. And just a quick word here on terminology. I'm calling a major space a significant area of your application. It probably has the same purpose, that particular major space, and usually an application has only a handful of really major spaces. A minor space is an area that will overlap onto a major space, but only for a brief period of time. And so you do not need to leave fully the major space when accessing a minor space, whereas changes between major spaces require leaving the prior major space to go to the next major space. And of course, the use of gestures can really help a user understand how spaces relate to each other. And this post here is going to look at 4 common design patterns for the positioning of major spaces in an application. 1 space, 2 spaces side by side, 2 spaces top and bottom, and 3 spaces side by side. And then at the end, we'll look at how they combine. So starting with 1 major space, in this case, the application never leaves the major space. And so typically with this design pattern, you might also have a bottom tab navigation bar. And in this case, what happens is by selecting the tabs on that bottom bar, the major space is almost replaced with another major space. And although multiple major spaces are used here, I really still call this just one single major space because these major spaces are physically related in the same positional area. For instance, if you consider this in 3 dimensions, you could see how the tabs along the bottom bar keep you within the same general 3-dimensional space. But by selecting the other tabs, you move to a different screen, but within the same major space area. You aren't really shifting to the left, you aren't shifting up, you aren't shifting down, you aren't shifting to the right. You're really staying statically within that major space. And the only reason that this works in this example is because you can physically see on that bottom navigation bar exactly the new space that you've replaced your 1 space with. And so if you're going to use an example like this, where you're going to have a single major space and you're going to swap it to have different types of functions, you really need the user to clearly understand what they've swapped the major space with and what the other alternative options are. Otherwise, it gets complicated. And as you'll see in these other examples, generally each major space really just serves one particular overall function. Let's look here, for instance, at the example of 2 major spaces. Most applications really are using this side-by-side design. If you think about any messaging application, iMessage, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, Signal, if you think about a standard inbox application for email such as Gmail, what you have is on your major space on the left, you have a list of most recent messages or most recent emails. And then when you select one of those items, it moves you to the space on the right, which is where you actually have the content of that message or email. And this is a really top-notch design because there's a back button which is physically located at the top of the screen, and when you select that, it moves you back to the left, which was the space you came from. And so it's really great because it synchronizes the gestures and the icons, and everything is kind of in sync here. And so you know that you're moving from the space on the left to the space on the right. It's very intuitive to know exactly where in the application you are. And just to blow this up into 3D here, what you can see is that we have, again, the major space on the left, the major space on the right, but that major space on the right will change. There are different types of, content it could have based on which user is being selected, but the content type is really remaining the same. It's always the content of a message thread. So we really have just 2 major spaces here. Another alternative option is to have the two major spaces really more stacked top to bottom. And so this example here from Apple Maps, but the classic is a bottom sheet, a bottom panel, which the user is able to pull up to the top of the screen to reveal the second major space. And so the second major space is one where searching happens, and in this case, the first major space is the actual map itself. And so the user is able to move between these two major spaces very easily. They can push down the second major space to the bottom of the screen, and they can pull it back to the top of the screen. And this is really an increasingly popular design on mobile, and for good reason, because I think it's a really good design. Here, what we have are three major spaces side by side, and the one which always comes to mind for me is Snapchat. What we see is when you load the application, in the middle you have your first major space, which is your ability to take an image or to access other features, and the user really can move to one of the other two major spaces, which are located on the left. You can swipe to the left, or you can click the button Friends, which moves you to the space on the left, which is the Friends page. Or you can move to the right, which is the Discover page, by either clicking on the Discover icon or by swiping over towards that direction. And again, we're synchronizing the gesture with the movement of how you're shifting through the app. And so I think Snapchat has always been really exemplary in at least its old version from years ago when I used to look at the application, on being able to have a clear understanding of where a user is in its positional space and having well demarcated spaces that you access through gestures. Now, of course, one of the problems with Snapchat always was that they never had these buttons at the bottom, and so it wasn't intuitive to users that you can move to the space on the left or on the right or on the top just by your swiping gestures. And so that's why later on they finally added in these icons so that users could get to it. And of course, you can combine these principles. So in this example here from Slack, what we have are two major spaces in the application. You really have your content area, and then you have your navigation area. And the navigation area itself is made up of three minor spaces side by side. And so you swipe left and right between these minor spaces in order to get from your workspace to your messages to find your navigational hierarchy, and then that generally is an entirely self-contained entity from the other major space, which is the content itself. There's a term I was throwing around called minor spaces, which is a space that comes into a major space, but you don't actually leave your major space. And so in this case, what we see is on the left, by clicking the search button, it pulls up, by selecting the user name, it pulls up a bottom panel which fills the screen, but you don't leave the space that you're physically in. Your major space remains the same. This panel just comes in on top. And the same here, by swiping from the right, you pull in a settings panel on the right, and it overlays over top of your major space. So mentally, the user is really not leaving the part of the app that they're in. Well, that's it. I think the conclusion is that you don't want to just teleport your user to different parts of the application. They really need to take a clear road to get there, and you need to have clear navigation which combines your gestures with the movement through the application so that the user knows when they're going from one major space to another major space, which makes it easier for them to get back and to understand the flow of your application. And of course, there are lots of other examples you could think of how people have arranged their major spaces, and it included minor spaces, but this is kind of what I would just say are maybe some general, more of the common trends. And when we apply this a little bit later on to building an electronic medical record, you want it to be very clear when the user moves from the home screen, where they're searching and they're performing non-patient chart related work, and when they then move into a different major space, which is the actual patient file, the patient chart itself, and then to, again, make it very clear as they move out of that patient chart into the other section of the application.